Alright, settle in friends. Let's dim the lights and get cozy, because we're about to dive into the very beginning of Arctic exploration, way before GPS and heated jackets. We're going to explore the initial motivations and preparations for these incredibly challenging journeys. So why did anyone even think about going to the Arctic in the first place? I mean, seriously. Think about it. Bone-chilling cold, endless ice, a landscape that seems utterly devoid of life. What was the draw? Well, there were a few key reasons, and honestly, they're a pretty interesting mix of noble and, shall we say, less noble ambitions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. First off, there was the whole Age of Discovery thing still kicking around. Even centuries after Columbus, there were still huge chunks of the world that were basically blank spaces on maps. And for Europeans, that was just unacceptable. They had this burning need to fill in those blanks, to chart every coastline, to claim every territory. So the Arctic, being stubbornly uncharted, presented a major challenge, a big question mark daring them to solve it. Then you had the quest for the Northwest Passage. This was a big one. Basically, European powers were desperate to find a sea route that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans via the Arctic. Think about it. Instead of sailing all the way around South America, a much faster route through the Arctic would open up massive trade opportunities with Asia. Spices, silks, all that good stuff, suddenly a whole lot easier to get. Countries were practically tripping over themselves to find it, and the fame and fortune that went with it. Now, let's not forget about good old scientific curiosity. Some explorers were genuinely interested in studying the Arctic environment, its geography, its wildlife, its magnetic fields, all of it. They wanted to understand this extreme environment and how it worked. And that's a pretty cool thing, right? There were also those fascinated with the potential for mineral resources. All of these unknowns piqued the interest of scientists to study this region and take notes of their findings. And of course, there was the allure of personal glory and national pride. Imagine being the first to reach the North Pole, or the first to chart a previously unknown Arctic island. That kind of accomplishment would cement your place in history, bring fame and fortune, and make your country look like a total rock star on the world stage. Okay, so people had their reasons for wanting to explore the Arctic. But how did they actually prepare for such an insane undertaking? It's not like they could just pop down to their local outdoor store and grab some high-tech gear. First, there was the ship. Most Arctic expeditions relied on sturdy sailing vessels, often reinforced to withstand the crushing pressure of the ice. These weren't exactly luxury liners, mind you. They were cramped, cold, and often infested with rats. But they were the best technology of the time, and they had to be tough enough to handle some seriously rough conditions. Picture these ships, made of wood, going up against colossal icebergs. Next up, supplies. These expeditions could last for years, so they needed to bring everything with them. Food, clothing, fuel, medicine, tools, weapons. It was a massive logistical undertaking. Food was a particular challenge. They relied heavily on preserved foods like salted meat, dried fish, and hardtack biscuits. Not exactly gourmet cuisine, but it kept them alive, or at least it was supposed to. They'd bring livestock to slaughter along the way in early exploration trips, but this was not always successful. Clothing was also super important, obviously. They needed to protect themselves from the extreme cold, so they wore layers of heavy wool clothing, fur hats, and thick mittens. But even with all that, frostbite was a constant threat. There were no synthetic fibers or advanced insulation back then, so they were pretty much relying on the same materials that people had been using for centuries. Then there were the scientific instruments. Explorers needed to be able to navigate, chart coastlines, and make scientific observations, so they brought compasses, sextants, telescopes, thermometers, and all sorts of other gadgets. These instruments weren't always super accurate, but they were the best tools they had for understanding the Arctic environment. Of course, no Arctic expedition would be complete without a well-trained crew. These guys had to be tough, resilient, and able to handle all sorts of challenges. They needed to be skilled sailors, navigators, hunters, and survivalists. And they had to be able to work together in close quarters for extended periods of time, which wasn't always easy, especially when things got stressful. One thing that's easy to forget is the level of planning that went into these expeditions. They had to map out their routes, anticipate potential problems, and develop contingency plans. They consulted with experienced sailors, read previous accounts of Arctic voyages, and tried to learn as much as they could about the region before they even set sail. But even with all that preparation, things could still go horribly wrong. The Arctic is an incredibly unforgiving environment, and even the best laid plans could be thrown off course by unexpected storms, shifting ice flows, or outbreaks of disease. In fact, it's almost comical how much these explorers underestimated the Arctic. They imagined a navigable sea, ice-free. They imagined land that could be settled. They didn't have a good understanding of what was coming for them. And that, my friends, is where the real adventure begins. Next time we'll be talking about what these explorers actually found when they arrived in the Arctic, the harsh realities, the unexpected challenges, and the sheer bone-chilling cold that would test them to their limits. So get ready to bundle up, because it's about to get frosty. Alright, so you've signed up for this Arctic adventure, huh? Maybe you're chasing glory, maybe you're running from something, or maybe you're just incredibly lost. Whatever the reason, welcome to the Arctic. And brace yourself, because the first taste of this place is, well, let's just say it's an acquired taste. The first thing that hits you, even before you see anything, is the cold. Now you might think you know cold. Maybe you've experienced a harsh winter back home, but trust me, that's amateur hour compared to the Arctic. This isn't a cold that just chills you to the bone. This is a cold that sneaks into your marrow, wraps around your organs, and whispers sweet nothings of hypothermia. Imagine stepping off your ship, a creaking, groaning wooden vessel that already feels woefully inadequate, and into a wall of air so frigid it feels solid. It's like being punched in the lungs. Every breath is a sharp, painful reminder that you are not in your element. The air itself seems to bite, nipping at any exposed skin. You quickly learn that any skin left uncovered is an invitation for frostbite, and frostbite is not a friend. It starts with a tingling, then numbness, then a slow creeping whiteness. Ignore it, and you might just lose a finger, a toe, or even more. And it's not just the air. The ground, even under your heavy boots, is deceptively treacherous. Often it's a mix of snow and ice, glazed over with a film of water that instantly freezes when it touches your skin. One wrong step, and you're down, struggling to get back up as the cold leaches the heat from your body. Then there's the ice itself. It's not just a frozen landscape. It's a dynamic, ever-shifting beast. You might step onto what looks like solid ground, only to find yourself on a floating ice floe, drifting further and further away from your ship, from safety, from any semblance of warmth. The ice groans and cracks beneath your feet, a constant reminder of its instability. You hear stories, and soon enough, you might witness them yourself, of explorers falling through the ice, disappearing into the frigid depths, never to be seen again. The Arctic doesn't offer second chances. The terrain itself is an exercise in unrelenting hardship. Forget rolling hills and pleasant meadows. Here, you're faced with jagged peaks, sheer cliffs of ice, and endless stretches of frozen wasteland. Every step is a battle against the elements. Sledges become your best friends. You're dragging them through thick snow and over unforgiving ice. The weight feels heavier with each passing hour, the muscles screaming in protest. And the wind, oh, the wind. The Arctic wind is a force of nature unlike any other. It howls across the landscape, carrying with it snow and ice that scour your face and eyes. It whips around you, finding every tiny gap in your clothing, relentlessly stealing your body heat. It's a constant, pervasive presence, a malevolent spirit that seems determined to drive you mad. Visibility? Forget about it. Whiteouts are common, where the sky and the ground blend into a seamless, featureless expanse of white. You lose all sense of direction, all sense of perspective. You're trapped in a blinding, disorienting void, with no way to tell which way is up, which way is down, which way is home. You feel a growing sense of panic creeping into your mind. You want to be anywhere else. This constant sensory deprivation takes a toll. The endless white, the biting cold, the howling wind, it all grinds you down, chipping away at your resolve, your sanity. You start to question why you ever came here in the first place. Was it really worth it? The glory, the fame, or was it just a fool's errand, a slow march towards a frozen grave? And that's just the physical aspect. The Arctic also assaults your senses in other, more subtle ways. The silence, for example. You might think silence would be peaceful, but the Arctic silence is different. It's a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the wind and the creaking of the ice. It's a silence that amplifies your own thoughts, your own fears, your own doubts. It allows the loneliness to seep into your soul, to fester and grow. The sheer scale of the landscape is overwhelming. You're surrounded by vast, empty spaces, stretching out to the horizon in every direction. You feel tiny, insignificant, utterly alone in the face of this immense, unforgiving wilderness. It's a humbling experience, but also a terrifying one. And then there's the light, or lack thereof. During the Arctic winter, the sun barely rises above the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The days are short, the nights are long, and the darkness seems to press in on you, both physically and mentally. The first taste of the Arctic, then, is a brutal awakening. It's a test of your physical endurance, your mental fortitude, and your very will to survive. Many explorers never made it past this first taste. They succumbed to the cold, the ice, the unforgiving terrain. They were swallowed by the wilderness, their dreams and ambitions buried beneath the snow and ice. But for those who do manage to persevere, who do manage to adapt, the Arctic can also reveal a strange, stark beauty, a beauty born of hardship, of resilience, of the enduring power of nature. It's a beauty that can only be truly appreciated by those who have faced the full force of the Arctic's wrath. And believe me, you will. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's imagine, just for a bit, that you've actually made it to the Arctic with some grand expedition. Not sitting in front of a screen, but there. What's next? Well, first you're confronted with what is essentially a massive frozen puzzle. Navigating the Arctic Ocean isn't like sailing on, say, the Caribbean. There are no clear, well-established shipping lanes. The ice itself is constantly moving, shifting and changing, creating a labyrinthine maze of waterways, dead ends, and sheer impassable barriers. So picture this: your ship, maybe a sturdy wooden vessel, or even one of those early steam-powered ships if you're feeling fancy. And around you, an endless expanse of ice. Not just smooth, solid ice, like a skating rink, mind you. We're talking jagged, fractured ice flows, towering icebergs that dwarf your ship, and pressure ridges where massive chunks of ice have collided, creating mountains of frozen chaos. It's beautiful, sure, in a harsh, unforgiving way, but it's also incredibly daunting. How do you even begin to navigate this mess? Well, first you need to chart the waters. Early explorers relied heavily on visual observation. Men were stationed high up on the masts, scanning the horizon for leads, those narrow channels of open water snaking through the ice. They'd call down directions to the helmsman, guiding the ship through the least treacherous paths. Sometimes they'd even climb onto the ice itself, scouting ahead to find the best route. Think about that for a second. Climbing out onto the moving ice, not knowing if it's stable, or if the channel you're trying to reach actually exists. But visual observation only gets you so far, especially with the notorious Arctic weather conditions. Fog, blizzards, and whiteouts were common occurrences, reducing visibility to near zero. In those conditions, explorers had to rely on their knowledge of ice patterns, currents, and wind directions to make educated guesses about the safest course. And of course, they had to create charts. Accurate charts were essential for future expeditions. Explorers meticulously recorded their observations, noting the positions of landmarks, the depths of the water, and the shapes and movements of the ice flows. This was painstaking work, often done in freezing temperatures and cramped quarters. Imagine trying to draw a detailed map while your hands are numb and the ship is rocking violently. But charting unknown waters was only half the battle. The other half was dealing with the unpredictable ice flows. The Arctic ice is constantly in motion, driven by winds and currents. Ice flows can shift and rotate, opening and closing channels with alarming speed. A passage that was clear 1 hour could be blocked the next. And that's not even considering the more dramatic events. Imagine being surrounded by ice, and then hearing a deafening roar as a massive ice flow suddenly cracks and splits, sending shards of ice flying in all directions. Sometimes ships would become trapped in the ice, completely frozen in place. This could be a terrifying experience, especially if winter was approaching. Explorers would have to prepare for a long, arduous wait, hoping that the ice would eventually break up and release their ship. Think of being stuck, completely helpless, at the mercy of the ice. The silence punctuated by the groaning and creaking of the ice around you. And sometimes the ice itself became a weapon. The immense pressure of the moving ice could crush a ship like an eggshell. There are stories of ships being squeezed so tightly that their timbers groaned and cracked and their hulls buckled and split. In those situations, the crew had to abandon ship and try to survive on the ice, hoping to reach land or be rescued. Not a nice thought, not at all. To combat these dangers, explorers developed various techniques. One common tactic was to use saws to cut channels through the ice, creating artificial waterways. This was incredibly labor-intensive work, but it could be necessary to free a trapped ship or to navigate through a particularly thick ice field. Can you picture what it must have been like, though? Hour after hour, soaring at ice, just to get a few more feet, while the cold seeps deeper and deeper into your bones. They also used explosives to blast through ice barriers, creating openings for their ships. This was a dangerous method, as explosives could be unpredictable and could damage the ship itself. But sometimes it was the only option. Navigating the Arctic also required a deep understanding of weather patterns. Arctic weather is notoriously volatile, with sudden storms and blizzards that can appear with little warning. Explorers had to learn to read the signs in the sky, to anticipate changes in the weather, and to take appropriate precautions. Things like securing the ship, preparing for strong winds, and stocking up on supplies. They also learned to adapt to the harsh conditions. They wore thick, warm clothing to protect themselves from the cold. They built shelters out of snow and ice to provide temporary refuge from the elements. And they learned to work together as a team, relying on each other for support and encouragement. Because in the Arctic, survival depended on cooperation. You couldn't afford to be selfish or lazy. Everyone had to pull their weight. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize these early Arctic explorations, to focus on the grand adventures, the heroic feats, and the scientific discoveries. But it's important to remember the harsh realities that these explorers faced. The constant danger, the physical hardship, and the psychological toll of isolation. Navigating the Arctic Ocean was a constant battle against the elements, a test of human endurance, and a journey into the unknown. It wasn't a game, it was life and death, and for many, it was death. Alright, let's settle in for a bit, shall we? Because behind all the icy landscapes and daring expeditions, there's a whole other battle being fought, the one inside the explorer's mind. Seals were a primary target, a crucial source of protein and fat, but these creatures were cunning and elusive. Days could be spent patiently, waiting by a breathing hole, harpoon poised, muscles screaming in protest against the cold and stillness. The slightest sound, the tiniest movement, could send them darting back into the icy depths, leaving you with nothing but frustration and dwindling hope. And the hunting itself. It wasn't some clean, efficient affair. It was messy, brutal, and often agonizingly slow. Imagine the sheer physical effort of hauling a seal, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds across the ice back to your camp. Every step is a struggle, every muscle burns. The fear of scavengers, polar bears, Arctic foxes nipping at your hard-won prize adds another layer of stress. Polar bears, of course, were both a blessing and a curse. A successful polar bear hunt could provide a mountain of meat and blubber, enough to sustain the crew for weeks. But confronting these massive predators was incredibly dangerous. They were powerful, intelligent, and fiercely protective. A single swipe of a paw could crush bone, a bite could tear flesh. Hunting them with the primitive weapons of the time, often just spears and rudimentary firearms, was a gamble where the odds were often stacked against you. And if you were lucky enough to kill a bear, imagine the mess. The sheer volume of blood, the stench of raw meat, the gruesome task of butchering the carcass in the freezing cold, fingers numb with cold, stomach churning. It wasn't glamorous, not at all. It was just survival. Sometimes desperation led to even more unpleasant measures. Imagine being reduced to scavenging for scraps, picking at the frozen remains of animals killed by others, or, and this is truly grim, resorting to cannibalism. It's a taboo that cuts to the very core of our humanity, but in the face of starvation, some explorers were forced to make that horrific choice. The Donner Party, Franklin's lost expedition, their stories are chilling reminders of the extremes to which hunger can drive us. And let's not forget the psychological toll, the constant pressure to provide, the fear of failure, the guilt of seeing your companions weaken and suffer. It all weighed heavily on the mind. Sleep offered little respite, haunted by nightmares of starvation and death. The Arctic silence, usually so profound, could become a torment, amplifying the fear and despair that gnawed at your soul. Even small victories came at a cost. A successful hunt might provide temporary relief, but it also brought the burden of responsibility. The meat had to be carefully rationed, the blubber rendered for fuel. Every scrap had to be used, nothing could be wasted, because tomorrow the hunt would begin again, and the next day, and the day after that, a relentless cycle of hunger, hardship, and desperate survival. So the next time you see a romanticized depiction of Arctic exploration, remember the reality behind the adventure. Remember the gnawing hunger, the bone-chilling cold, the constant fear, and the brutal, often heartbreaking, struggle to secure food in a barren landscape. It was a trial of endurance, a test of the human spirit, and a stark reminder of the fragility of life in the face of nature's unforgiving power. It was a very bad time indeed, and probably very boring in between the hunting. Waiting and waiting and waiting, only to see nothing, feel nothing, and be rewarded with nothing. And so the slow walk home begins again. Maybe the next day will be better. Maybe. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's talk about something truly fascinating. The encounters these Arctic explorers had with the Inuit people. It's a crucial part of the story, and honestly, it's where things get really interesting, and where we can really learn some important lessons too. Now, when these expeditions first started bumping into the Inuit, or Eskimos as they were often called back then, it wasn't always smooth sailing. I mean, imagine these European explorers, completely unprepared for the Arctic conditions, suddenly face to face with a culture that had not only survived but thrived in this environment for centuries. The Inuit, you see, possessed a profound understanding of the Arctic. It was practically encoded into their DNA after generations of living and adapting. They knew how to build shelters from snow and ice, how to hunt seals and whales, how to navigate using the stars and the subtle shifts in the ice. Their entire way of life was intricately interwoven with the environment. They understood it in ways the explorers simply couldn't. Think about it. These explorers were often burdened by their own cultural assumptions, their preconceived notions of what constituted civilization. They'd show up with these grand ideas about claiming land and finding new trade routes, often overlooking the fact that people were already living there, managing the land sustainably, and had been for a very, very long time. Navigating these cultural differences could be really tricky. Communication was often a huge barrier, of course. Imagine trying to explain your intentions when you don't even speak the same language. There were gestures, attempts at pidgin languages, and sometimes, sadly, complete misunderstandings that led to conflict. But more often than not, the Inuit were willing to help, at least initially. They saw these newcomers struggling, clearly out of their depth, and their instinct was to offer assistance. The explorers who were wise enough to actually learn from the Inuit, to observe their techniques and ask for their guidance, were the ones who had a much better chance of survival. They learned how to build igloos, those ingenious snow shelters that provided surprisingly effective insulation against the frigid temperatures. They learned how to hunt seals, a crucial source of food and fat for warmth and energy. They learned how to make clothing from animal skins, far superior to the heavy wool garments the explorers had brought with them from Europe. But even when the explorers accepted help, there were often underlying issues of power and respect. The explorers, backed by their governments and their technological superiority, often viewed the Inuit as somehow primitive or uncivilized. They'd trade with them, often unfairly, offering things like metal tools or beads in exchange for valuable furs and resources, sometimes taking advantage of the Inuits' lack of understanding of Western economic systems. And then there was the issue of cultural exchange. The explorers brought with them diseases that the Inuit had never encountered before, diseases like measles and smallpox which decimated their populations. This was a tragic and unintended consequence of contact, but it had a devastating impact on Inuit communities. Beyond the practical survival skills, the Inuit also had a very different worldview that was often difficult for the explorers to grasp. Their relationship with nature was based on respect and reciprocity. They saw themselves as part of the environment, not as masters of it. They believed that animals had spirits and that they needed to be treated with respect, even when they were being hunted for food. This spiritual dimension was often lost on the explorers who were more focused on scientific observation and resource extraction. The Inuit also had a very different sense of community. They were highly cooperative, sharing resources and responsibilities. Their social structures were based on consensus and cooperation, rather than hierarchy and competition. For instance, imagine an explorer who kills a seal without making proper respectful ceremonies afterwards. It would offend the animal's spirit and make hunting more difficult in the future. Or think about sharing your food with others. In Inuit culture, hoarding food is considered extremely rude. Over time, some explorers developed a deeper understanding and appreciation of Inuit culture. They learned the language, studied their customs, and even formed lasting friendships. These explorers often became advocates for the Inuit, speaking out against the injustices they faced and trying to protect their way of life. People like Knud Rasmussen, a Danish explorer with Inuit ancestry, dedicated his life to studying and documenting Inuit culture. He traveled extensively throughout the Arctic, collecting stories, songs, and artifacts. He became a bridge between two worlds, helping to promote understanding and respect between the Inuit and the West. Rasmussen, through his journeys and documented research, was able to offer a glimpse into a world of traditions, beliefs, and practices that were so incredibly well adapted to the challenging environments, and for centuries were a core element for Inuit survival. The encounters between Arctic explorers and the Inuit are a complex and often troubling chapter in history. It's a story of cultural exchange, but also of exploitation and misunderstanding. But it's also a story of human resilience and adaptation, and the importance of respecting different ways of life. By understanding these encounters, we can learn valuable lessons about how to approach cross-cultural interactions with humility, respect, and a genuine desire to learn from one another. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Okay, let's talk about something truly amazing. Something that could pierce even the most despairing heart in the Arctic, the aurora borealis. Imagine, if you will, weeks or even months of unending darkness. The sun, a distant memory. The landscape, a monochrome canvas of white and black. Your world, confined to the claustrophobic space of a ship, a tent, or perhaps a hastily constructed igloo. The cold, an ever-present enemy, gnawing at your fingers, seeping into your bones. Scurvy is setting in, and the reality that you may never see home again is becoming more and more probable. It is easy to lose hope, isn't it? And then one night, it happens. The sky, which has been a dull, oppressive blanket for so long, begins to shimmer. A faint, ethereal glow appears on the horizon, like the first hint of dawn. But this is no dawn. This is something far more magical. Slowly the light intensifies, morphing into ribbons and curtains of color. Emerald green, the dominant hue, dances and sways across the heavens. Hints of pink, violet, and even a deep blood red begin to appear, adding to the otherworldly spectacle. The aurora borealis, the northern lights. It's a sight that can stop you in your tracks, stealing your breath away. For those early Arctic explorers, it must have been an experience of profound and almost spiritual significance. Think about it. They were men, often religious, facing the absolute limits of human endurance. They were confronted by the power of nature in its most unforgiving form. They were wrestling with their own mortality, staring into the face of oblivion. And then this breathtaking display of light and color, a celestial ballet performed just for them. It would have been a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, beauty could still exist, that even in the face of death, life could still find a way to express itself. The science behind the aurora, of course, wasn't fully understood at the time. We know now that it's caused by charged particles from the sun colliding with the Earth's atmosphere. These particles, guided by the Earth's magnetic field, interact with gases like oxygen and nitrogen, creating the stunning colors we see. Oxygen, when excited by these particles, produces the characteristic green and sometimes red light. Nitrogen, on the other hand, emits blues and purples. But to those early explorers, the science wouldn't have mattered. What mattered was the experience itself, the feeling of awe and wonder that washed over them as they gazed upon this celestial phenomenon. Imagine the hushed whispers, the sense of shared reverence, as men who had been hardened by months of hardship suddenly found themselves united by something beautiful and inexplicable. It must have felt like a direct connection to something greater than themselves, a glimpse into the divine. The aurora wasn't just a pretty light show, you see. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the most desolate and unforgiving environments, there was still magic to be found. It was a source of inspiration, urging them to keep going, to push through the pain and the despair. It offered a moment of respite from the relentless cold, the gnawing hunger, the psychological toll of isolation. It allowed them to forget, if only for a little while, the dangers that surrounded them and the uncertainties that lay ahead. These Arctic voyagers left us with some fantastic journals. A recurring theme is the discussion of the aurora and its effect on morale. You can almost see the desperation as they write that the spectacle gave them the strength they would need for the next day. The aurora also likely offered these voyagers a sense of connection. In a world that was rapidly becoming smaller, the same lights danced above their loved ones' homes as above the Arctic wastes. In a way, the aurora borealis was a testament to the power of the human spirit. It was a reminder that even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds, we are still capable of finding beauty, of experiencing wonder, of holding on to hope. So the next time you find yourself feeling overwhelmed by the darkness, remember the Arctic explorers and their encounter with the northern lights. Remember that even in the bleakest of landscapes, beauty can still exist, and hope can still shine through. All you have to do is look up. Even if there is no dancing light in the sky, you can find the beauty and the hope. I know you can. Okay, so imagine this. You're finally settling into your bunk after a long day. Maybe you're even starting to drift off, but suddenly, crack, a sound cuts through the groaning of the ship. Not a little crack, mind you, a deep, resonant crack that vibrates through the very hull beneath your feet. You're jolted awake. Now, you're not imagining things. This isn't just some old timber settling. This is the sound of the Arctic ice, the relentless, unforgiving ice, squeezing your vessel like a walnut in a vise. It's a sound that would become as familiar and as dreaded as the creaking of the bunks or the taste of salted pork. These ships, you see, they weren't exactly designed for these conditions. Sure, they were sturdy, built with thick timbers to withstand the ocean's fury, but the Arctic ice, that's a different beast altogether. It doesn't just crash against the hull like waves in a storm. It crushes. It exerts pressure measured in tons per square inch, slowly, relentlessly, until something has to give. And that something, more often than not, was the ship itself. Think about it. You're in a wooden vessel, surrounded by frozen ocean, expanding and contracting with the temperature. The ice presses inward, and the ship's timbers start to groan and bend. You can hear them protesting, a symphony of pops and creaks, as the wood fibers strain and complain. Sometimes it's a slow, agonizing process, taking days, weeks even. Other times it's sudden and violent. A massive ice flow shifts, and wham! The ship lurches, timbers splinter, and seams burst. The immediate aftermath is chaos. Men scramble from their bunks, half-dressed, fear etched on their faces. Some are shouting, trying to assess the damage. Others are silent, paralyzed by the sheer terror of the situation. The ship, once a safe haven, is now a potential death trap. And the smell, that's something you can't forget. The sharp, acrid scent of splintered wood, mixed with the metallic tang of seawater flooding in. Maybe a whiff of coal smoke, if the galley stove is still lit, adding another layer of anxiety. The damage could range from minor leaks, manageable with pumps and some quick carpentry, to catastrophic breaches that threaten to sink the vessel entirely. And believe me, the prospect of sinking in the Arctic Ocean is not a pleasant one. Icy water, hypothermia setting in within minutes. The sheer terror of being plunged into the freezing depths. It's enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. But even if the ship doesn't sink immediately, the damage presents a whole new set of problems. A compromised hull means that the ship is more vulnerable to future ice pressure. The leaks, even small ones, can lead to dangerous ice buildup inside the ship. Imagine the decks coated in a slick, treacherous layer of ice, making every movement a risky proposition, and the constant dampness that leads to mold, mildew, and all sorts of unpleasantness that can exacerbate existing health problems and create new ones. Now, if you're really unlucky, the damage is so severe that the ship is deemed irreparable. That's when the real nightmare begins. The prospect of being stranded, hundreds of miles from civilization, with limited supplies and the Arctic winter looming. It's a scenario that tested the limits of human endurance. The crew might try to salvage what they can: food, tools, weapons, navigational instruments. Everything is carefully inventoried and rationed because every ounce counts. Then they would have to face the daunting task of planning their escape. That might involve trekking across the ice to a known whaling station or attempting to reach indigenous communities for help. Journal entries from these expeditions are filled with accounts of depression, anxiety, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness. Men who were once strong, resolute leaders found themselves paralyzed by indecision, plagued by self-doubt. Petty squabbles escalated into violent confrontations. Team cohesion crumbled under the weight of the darkness. One particularly haunting account describes a member of the Franklin expedition who, driven to the edge of madness by the unending night, began to believe that the darkness itself was a sentient being, a malevolent force actively trying to drive them insane. That's how powerful this lack of light can be. The lack of vitamin D played a huge role. You know vitamin D, the sunshine vitamin. Now obviously, it's impossible to get that in the dead of the Arctic winter. A vitamin D deficiency can cause depression, fatigue, bone pain, the list goes on. Symptoms that would be hard enough to deal with on their own, never mind in a frozen wasteland. So how did they cope? Well, some tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. They would stick to strict routines, adhering to a schedule as if the sun were still rising and setting. Meals at the same time, work periods, even social gatherings, all attempts to impose order on a world consumed by chaos. Artificial light was crucial too. Candles, oil lamps, anything to push back the darkness, to create a small sphere of warmth and light in the overwhelming void. But these light sources were often inadequate, casting long, distorted shadows that only added to the sense of unease. Plus, they were a fire hazard in cramped, ice-covered living quarters. Reading became a popular pastime. Books provided an escape, a temporary refuge from the harsh reality of their surroundings. But even reading could become a struggle. The dim light strained the eyes, and the constant fatigue made it difficult to concentrate. Music, too, offered solace. Singing, playing instruments, anything to lift the spirits, to remind them of the world they had left behind. But instruments were fragile and easily damaged by the cold, and the same songs, repeated endlessly, could become grating after a while. And then there was alcohol. A tempting escape from the darkness and the despair, but a dangerous one. Alcohol exacerbated existing tensions, fueled arguments, and impaired judgment. Many expeditions strictly limited or even banned alcohol consumption, recognizing the threat it posed to team cohesion. Perhaps the most effective coping mechanism was simply talking, sharing their fears, their anxieties, their hopes, finding solace in the shared experience. But even this could be difficult. The Arctic encouraged silence. The vastness of the landscape, the unending darkness, it all seemed to conspire to stifle conversation, to isolate each individual in their own private hell. Ultimately, surviving the Arctic winter was a battle of wills, a constant struggle to maintain hope in the face of overwhelming adversity, to find light in the darkness, both literally and figuratively. It was a test of the human spirit, and one that many failed. So the next time you're feeling down, remember those early explorers huddled in their icy shelters, battling the unending night. Their struggle reminds us of the power of light, both physical and metaphorical, and the importance of human connection in the face of adversity. And maybe, just maybe, it will give you the strength to push through your own darkness, whatever form it may take. Alright, let's settle in and think about something really crucial for those early Arctic explorers. It wasn't just about battling the elements, it was about battling them together. I mean, imagine being stuck in that frozen wasteland, thousands of miles from home, with your life utterly dependent on the guys beside you. Pretty quickly, those guys stop being just crewmates and start being, well, everything. Think about it. You're facing constant peril. The ice could crack at any moment, plunging you into frigid waters. A blizzard could roll in and bury your camp. Starvation is a constant threat, day in, day out. This kind of pressure just forges bonds that are absolutely unbreakable. In the relative comfort of your home, you might have plenty of time and inclination to choose your friends carefully, but out there you're thrown together with a group of people with diverse, often conflicting minds' personalities, and your survival hinges on whether you can work together effectively. Now, it wasn't always sunshine and roses, of course. Close quarters, dwindling supplies, and the sheer monotony of the Arctic winter could really fray nerves. You might get annoyed by the way someone chewed their pemmican or their persistent optimism despite the situation, but these kinds of things quickly become secondary to getting through the night. Disagreements, even heated ones, were almost inevitable, but they usually ended with a grudging respect. They had to. There was simply no room for petty squabbles when your life depended on the team functioning as a unit. And it wasn't all just about survival in the most basic sense. There was a huge psychological component to it too. Imagine the crushing loneliness, the isolation from everything familiar, the constant fear of the unknown. Being able to share that burden with your fellow explorers, to offer a word of encouragement, or just a friendly ear, could be the difference between maintaining sanity and succumbing to despair. And really, what else did they have? It's these shared moments of vulnerability that really cemented those bonds. Think about huddled together inside an igloo during a raging blizzard, sharing stories of home, trying to conjure up memories of warmth and laughter. Or the quiet camaraderie of sharing a meager meal, knowing that everyone is making a sacrifice. Or the sheer joy of spotting a seal after weeks of fruitless hunting, knowing that it meant the difference between life and death. These moments, even the small ones, created a sense of shared purpose and mutual reliance that just transcended everything else. Explorers like Admiral Peary, who had a reputation for being quite autocratic, knew how critical these interpersonal dynamics were. While his leadership style could be tough, he also recognized the importance of cultivating loyalty and fostering a sense of team spirit. He would often share his own rations, a big gesture, and he participated in many of the dangerous hunting expeditions himself. This demonstrated that he was willing to share the risks with his crew, not just order them around. He understood that leading in such an environment meant earning respect through shared hardship, and that in turn required him to put his life on the line, the same as his men. Beyond that, it was about specialization as well. It might seem simple, but in reality, the different skills they brought from their previous lives were so important to maintaining their ability to move forward in what might seem like insurmountable odds. And they all relied on each other to provide it. It wasn't a choice. The shipwright needed the cook needed the doctor, and so on. Think about the expeditions themselves and the way they relied on others. Take the Franklin expedition, for example. Bad leadership aside, they were at the cutting edge of technology at the time, with steam-powered ships and preserved food. Ultimately, it all was in vain, but what if they had had the indigenous people by their side, more like the Roald Amundson's expedition or Robert Edwin Peary? They each had men who were Inuit guiding them, teaching them to hunt, to build, to dress in the correct fur. It goes without saying that they had a much better chance, but it wasn't just them learning, it was a joint venture. It's important to remember that these weren't just hardened adventurers. Many of these men were ordinary people, thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They had families back home, dreams of their own. The Arctic didn't care about that. What mattered was their willingness to set aside their individual ambitions and work together for the common good. And sometimes, the most unexpected alliances were formed. Rivalries might dissolve, prejudices might fade, as men from different backgrounds and social classes found themselves united by their shared struggle for survival. You see, at the end of the day, human connection and shared hardship, that's what made these expeditions bearable, even inspiring. It's a testament to the power of the human spirit, the ability to find strength in each other, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. It's a lesson that resonates far beyond the icy wastes of the Arctic. So next time you're feeling isolated or overwhelmed, remember those Arctic explorers. Remember the bonds they forged in the face of death. Remember that even in the darkest of times, human connection can be a lifeline. And if you ever get stuck in the Arctic with a group of strangers, just remember to share your pemmican. It might just save your life and your sanity. Alright, settle in folks, let's get comfy. We've faced the blizzards, fought off the scurvy, and just generally endured the unimaginable. But now, a question: why? Why did anyone in their right mind choose that life? I mean seriously, consider the options back home. Relatively speaking, they were pleasant. So what was the big draw? What fueled this almost manic push into the frozen unknown? Well, let's start with the obvious: fame. The bright, shiny lure of making a name for yourself. Think of it like becoming a YouTube sensation, only much colder and significantly more likely to result in your slow, agonizing death. The promise of having your name etched into the maps, of being the guy who charted some previously uncharted coastline, that's powerful stuff. These weren't just everyday folks, they were often driven, ambitious individuals who saw the Arctic as their Everest, their shot at immortality. Consider figures like, well, pick almost any of the major explorers. They weren't exactly shrinking violets. They wanted glory, they wanted recognition, they wanted to be remembered. And the Arctic, with its vast emptiness and inherent danger, offered a tantalizing shortcut to that recognition. After all, planting a flag somewhere no one had ever planted a flag before is a pretty solid way to guarantee a spot in the history books. It's kind of like inventing a new flavor of ice cream that cures cancer. But instead of ice cream, it's ice. And instead of curing cancer, it's potentially giving it to yourself. The reward was worth the risk in their minds. Then there's the allure of fortune, cold hard cash, or in this case, maybe cold hard whale blubber, or walrus ivory, or whatever exotic commodity the Arctic held hostage. The 19th century was a time of rampant capitalism, and the Arctic represented a last, largely untapped resource base. Think of it as the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme, albeit one with slightly higher mortality rates than your average pyramid scheme. Governments and private companies alike poured money into Arctic exploration, hoping to unlock new trade routes, discover valuable minerals, or exploit the region's abundant wildlife. Seal oil, whalebone, fur, these were incredibly valuable commodities back then, and whoever controlled their supply stood to make a fortune. This drove many expeditions, pure and simple. It wasn't about science, it was about profit. Men were willing to risk everything for a chance to strike it rich, even if that meant spending years in the frozen wasteland battling the elements and fending off scurvy. It's basically a gold rush, but with glaciers instead of gold nuggets. But let's not be too cynical, okay? While fame and fortune were definitely major motivators, there was also, I think, a genuine desire to explore. A deep-seated human curiosity to see what's over the horizon, to push the boundaries of the known world. Remember, this was the age of exploration, a time when the map of the world was still being filled in, and the Arctic represented one of the last major blank spaces. Think about it. You're staring at a map, and most of it is detailed, accurate, known. Then there's this big, ominous white blob at the top. You just have to know what's there, right? That insatiable human urge to learn, to discover, to understand, that played a huge role. These explorers weren't just driven by ego or greed. They were driven by a thirst for knowledge. They wanted to understand the Arctic ecosystem, to study the ice, the animals, the geology, and the people who lived there. They were scientists and adventurers, pushing the limits of human understanding, even at great personal risk. Furthermore, we can't discount the simple allure of the unknown. There is always something to say for the idea of just wandering into a place that has never seen the kind of civilization you know. It's not just fame or fortune at that point. It becomes a spiritual thing. What kind of thoughts does a man have when he is utterly, truly alone, days from help in any direction? The answer to that question, and not anything material, is what drove certain kinds of explorers. Also, it's worth considering that there were varying degrees of both genuine exploration and fame fortune seeking. A lot of exploration was, and frankly still is, done by national powers. The British wanted a Northwest Passage more than they wanted scientific insight, though they would have gladly taken that too, of course. These nations in turn needed people to actually travel to the Arctic. These men, the captains and leaders, were often just professionals, people just doing their jobs. They may have been driven by some degree of personal glory, but more than anything else they just went. It was what they were told to do, and of course all these motivations often overlap. An explorer might have been driven by a genuine desire to explore, but he also wasn't going to turn down the chance to make a name for himself in the process. Similarly, a businessman might have been primarily interested in profit, but he might also have felt a sense of adventure and excitement at the prospect of opening up new trade routes. It's rarely one thing or the other. Human motivation is messy. So when we look at the motivations behind Arctic exploration, it's important to consider the full spectrum of factors: the lure of fame, the promise of fortune, the thirst for knowledge, the demands of nations, and that deep-seated human desire to push the boundaries of the known world. All these things played a role, driving men and women to risk everything in pursuit of the frozen North. And boy did they risk everything. As we all know by now, the North doesn't give anything up easy, and sometimes it never gives it back at all. Alright, so, we've followed these Arctic expeditions, we've seen the excitement, the initial burst of optimism, the methodical approach to survival, but inevitably, something breaks, and when it does, it's rarely just a simple fracture, it's a full-blown collapse of team cohesion. Think of it like this: you're trapped in a pressure cooker made of ice, and the lid is starting to rattle. The breaking point in Arctic exploration, often it wasn't the ice itself, but the internal strife, the human element. You put a group of individuals under immense pressure, isolate them from everything they know and love, starve them, freeze them, and you're going to see cracks appear. Cracks that widen into chasms. Mutiny was a real and terrifying possibility. Remember that hierarchy, that chain of command we talked about earlier? Well, starvation has a funny way of leveling the playing field. When the leader's decisions start looking less like calculated risks and more like blatant incompetence, well, that's when the grumbling starts. And grumbling can quickly escalate. Imagine the scene months into the journey. Food supplies are dwindling, scurvy is ravaging the crew, and the captain, bundled in furs, is still stubbornly pushing onward, driven by some abstract notion of glory. Meanwhile, the men, their bodies aching, their spirits crushed, are staring into the abyss of a frozen death. The temptation to take matters into their own hands must have been immense. Is this really worth it? Is his ambition worth my life? Instances of outright mutiny are, understandably, not always well documented. Who wants to record their own act of treason? But history whispers tales of captains mysteriously falling overboard, of sudden changes in course that defied all logic, of shifts in power dynamics that can only be explained by a blade in the dark or a carefully orchestrated coup. It's a dark chapter, but a very real one. Then there's desertion. Not necessarily the dramatic running off into the snow kind, though that certainly happened. More often, it was a gradual withdrawal, a quiet resignation. Men simply stopped pulling their weight. They became listless, unresponsive. They might perform their assigned tasks, but with a sullen reluctance that poisoned the atmosphere. They became a drain, a liability. Think about it. You're surrounded by nothing but white, endless white. You know that rescue is virtually impossible. Hope dwindles with each passing day. What's the point of working yourself to the bone if you're just going to die anyway? That kind of apathy is contagious. It spreads through the crew like a disease, undermining morale and making survival even less likely. It's a subtle form of rebellion, a slow-motion suicide pact, and beyond mutiny and desertion, there's just plain old garden variety in fighting. Petty grievances, personality clashes that, in normal circumstances, would be easily brushed aside, become magnified under the Arctic sun, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Imagine being cooped up in a cramped, dimly lit cabin, with the same few people for months on end, with no privacy, no escape. Every little quirk, every irritating habit, becomes unbearable. Perhaps someone chews too loudly, or snores like a walrus, or constantly complains about the cold. In a normal setting, you just roll your eyes and move on. But in the Arctic, those seemingly minor annoyances can fester, breeding resentment and animosity. Arguments erupt over the smallest things. Who gets the warmest bunk? Who ate the last biscuit? Who's not pulling their fair share? And remember, these were often men from very different backgrounds, with different levels of education, different values, different expectations. The initial camaraderie, fueled by shared adventure and a sense of purpose, quickly erodes under the weight of hardship and disillusionment. Suddenly, those differences become glaringly apparent. Prejudices surface, alliances crumble, the team splinters into factions. The leader, of course, bears a heavy responsibility for preventing this collapse. He has to be a diplomat, a mediator, a psychologist, a father figure, all while battling his own demons. He has to maintain discipline without resorting to brutality. He has to inspire hope without resorting to empty promises. It's an almost impossible task. And when the leader falters, when he shows weakness or indecision, the whole edifice can come crashing down. What does this breakdown of team cohesion actually look like? It's the icy silence that descends upon the camp. It's the furtive glances, the whispered conversations behind closed doors. It's the refusal to cooperate, the sabotage of equipment, the open defiance of orders. It's the growing sense of unease, the feeling that anything could happen at any moment. It's the loss of trust, the fundamental belief that your fellow crew members have your back, that they're all in this together, that they'll do whatever it takes to ensure your survival. That's gone, replaced by suspicion, paranoia, and a chilling sense of isolation. And that, more than the cold, more than the starvation, more than the endless darkness, that's what can truly break a man. That's what can lead to the ultimate failure of the expedition. Because in the Arctic, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And when the chain breaks, everyone is in danger. Alright, let's get into one of the grimmest realities of Arctic exploration, the razor-thin line between survival and utter disaster. Forget the glory, forget the scientific discovery for a moment. Imagine stepping out your front door and knowing that the smallest mistake, the slightest miscalculation, could be your last. It wasn't just a possibility, it was a constant gnawing presence. Accidents, you see, were almost a guarantee. The terrain itself was an enemy. Imagine treacherous ice, constantly shifting, hiding deep crevasses waiting to swallow you whole. One wrong step, a moment's inattention, and you could plunge into icy water or vanish into a gap never to be seen again. These weren't rare occurrences either. They were woven into the daily fabric of life. Men fell from sledges, were crushed by collapsing snowdrifts, or simply disappeared during blizzards. Their bodies never recovered. And if the ground wasn't trying to kill you, the cold certainly was. Frostbite wasn't just an uncomfortable nuisance. It was a relentless predator, silently claiming fingers, toes, noses, ears. Sometimes the entire limb was blackened, frozen solid like a macabre sculpture. The pain, well, the accounts are harrowing. A burning, searing ache that never truly subsided, especially as the limb thawed, if it ever had the chance. Amputation was often the only recourse, a brutal procedure performed with rudimentary tools and little to no anesthetic, far from any medical aid. But perhaps the most insidious threat of all was hypothermia. It wasn't dramatic, like a fall into icy water. It was subtle, creeping in slowly, numbing your mind as well as your body. The initial shivers give way to a strange, almost comforting warmth, a false sense of security. Your thinking becomes clouded, your movements sluggish, you lose coordination. Simple tasks like lighting a fire or navigating become impossible. And then, oblivion, a slow, silent slide into unconsciousness, and eventually, death. Preventing hypothermia was a constant battle of small, crucial details. Layering clothing was essential, but it had to be the right clothing. Wool was king, trapping air even when wet, providing a crucial barrier against the cold, but wool alone wasn't enough. Sealskin, fur, carefully crafted garments made by indigenous people. These were the lifelines that kept the worst of the cold at bay. And it wasn't just what you wore, it was how you wore it. Keeping clothes dry was paramount. Perspiration could be as deadly as falling into the ocean. So, meticulous attention to ventilation was key. Loosening layers during exertion, ensuring air could circulate, preventing the buildup of moisture. This was a constant balancing act, a delicate dance between warmth and sweat. Food was your internal furnace. High-calorie, fat-rich foods were vital to fuel your body's internal heating system. Pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat and sometimes berries, became a staple for many expeditions. It wasn't exactly gourmet cuisine, but it provided the energy needed to fight the cold, and you had to eat regularly, even if you weren't hungry. Skipping meals was a luxury no one could afford. Shelter, even the most rudimentary, was a necessity. Igloos, ingeniously constructed from blocks of snow, provided surprisingly effective insulation. But building an igloo was an art, requiring skill, patience, and the right type of snow. Tents offered some protection, but were vulnerable to wind and snow drifts. Finding or creating even a small pocket of warmth could be the difference between life and death. And perhaps most importantly, there was the mental aspect. Maintaining morale, keeping spirits high, was crucial in the face of relentless cold and danger. Fear, despair, and panic could be just as deadly as the weather itself. So singing songs, telling stories, sharing moments of laughter, these were the small acts of defiance against the encroaching darkness. The Arctic demanded constant vigilance, a hyper-awareness of your body, your surroundings, your limitations. It was a place where arrogance was swiftly punished, where complacency was a death sentence. It was a world where the line between life and death was so thin, so easily crossed, that survival itself felt like a victory. It's hard for us to truly grasp today just how precarious every single day was. No wonder we continue to be fascinated, even awed, by those who dared to venture into that frozen, unforgiving landscape. And so, the relentless Arctic, ever indifferent, continued its assault. We pushed, we strained, we exhausted ourselves, but the ice simply didn't care. We'd envisioned a triumphant march across the top of the world, a banner planted in the name of science, of country, of personal glory. Instead, we were trapped in a frozen maze, each path leading only to another dead end. The first signs weren't dramatic, they were subtle, insidious. A quietness descended upon the crew, a tightening of lips, a lingering gaze towards the horizon that spoke of unspoken fears. The rations, once plentiful, began to dwindle. The hunting became harder, the seals fewer, the polar bears more elusive. Scurvy, that silent killer, tightened its grip, turning smiles into grimaces of pain. But more than the physical hardship, it was the erosion of hope that truly began to eat away at us. We'd started with such optimism, such unshakable belief in our abilities, our planning, our sheer willpower. Every setback had been met with renewed determination. We'll find a way, we'd tell ourselves, forcing a cheerfulness that felt increasingly hollow. But now, the setbacks were mounting, relentless, and the ways seemed to vanish before we could grasp them. The meticulously drawn charts, once symbols of progress, became mocking reminders of our failure to predict the ice's capricious movements. The instruments, so carefully calibrated, seemed to taunt us with their unchanging readings, reflecting the stagnation of our expedition. The journals, filled with detailed observations and hopeful projections, now lay largely untouched, victims of a growing apathy. The men began to argue more frequently. Petty grievances, once easily dismissed, became sources of bitter resentment. The shared purpose that had bound us together started to fray, replaced by a gnawing sense of individual despair. Sleep offered little respite, haunted by nightmares of crushing ice, of endless white landscapes, of the faces of loved ones fading into the Arctic gloom. It was during one particularly brutal stretch, after weeks of struggling against a seemingly impenetrable ice floe, that the realization truly dawned. We were not conquering the Arctic was conquering us. We had thrown everything we had at it, our strength, our ingenuity, our courage, and it had simply shrugged, unmoved. The moment was almost anticlimactic. There was no dramatic confrontation, no single catastrophic event. It was more like a slow leak, a gradual draining of vital energy, until only emptiness remained. The captain, a man of unwavering resolve, called a meeting. His face was etched with exhaustion, his eyes reflecting the same bleak landscape that stretched before us. He spoke quietly, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. He laid out the facts, stark and unyielding. The dwindling rations, the spreading scurvy, the impenetrable ice, the sheer distance between us and any hope of rescue. And then, he said the words that none of us wanted to hear, but all of us knew were true. We must turn back. A wave of silence followed, a silence deeper and more profound than any we had experienced in the Arctic. It was the silence of defeat, of dreams shattered, of ambition extinguished. Some men wept openly, tears freezing on their cheeks. Others stared blankly ahead, lost in their own private hells. A few muttered in protest, clinging desperately to the fading hope of success. But the captain stood firm. He knew that continuing on this path would mean certain death for all of us. Turning back was not an admission of weakness, but an act of survival. It was the most difficult decision he had ever had to make, but he knew it was the only one. The decision was made, but its consequences were far-reaching. The men had pinned their hopes on the potential rewards of a successful expedition: fame, fortune, scientific recognition. Now they faced the prospect of returning home empty-handed, perhaps even in disgrace. The weight of failure was heavy, a burden that threatened to crush their spirits. The journey back was even harder than the journey forward. The same ice that had trapped us now seemed to mock us, slowing our progress at every turn. The scurvy worsened, claiming more victims. The cold became more unbearable, the darkness more oppressive. The men were shadows of their former selves, driven only by the primal instinct to survive. But even in the depths of despair, something flickered within us, a spark of resilience, a refusal to surrender completely. We had failed in our primary mission, but we could still strive to return home, to tell our story, to warn others of the Arctic's brutal power, and perhaps in the telling, we could find some measure of redemption. The decision to turn back was not the end of our ordeal, but a new beginning. It was a recognition of our limits, an acceptance of our vulnerability, and a testament to the enduring human spirit that refuses to be extinguished, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The loss of hope, devastating as it was, ultimately paved the way for something else, a desperate, unwavering determination to live. And that, in the end, was perhaps the greatest victory we could achieve. All right, let's talk about something not so fun, something downright terrifying. Imagine this: you're stranded. Miles and miles of frozen wasteland stretch out in every direction. Your ship, well, it's not a ship anymore. More like a collection of splintered wood and memories, slowly being swallowed by the ice. Hope is a fragile thing in the Arctic. And right now, yours is hanging by a thread, a thin, icy thread. So what do? You search for rescue. It's not a quick process, it's slow and desperate. The first instinct, of course, is to try and signal for help. But remember, this isn't the 21st century. There are no cell phones, no satellite beacons. Your options are limited, to say the least. One of the most common methods: fire. Building a massive signal fire was a way to punch through the monotonous white with a plume of dark smoke, hoping, praying that it might be seen by a passing ship, or perhaps a searching party sent out by your expedition's sponsors. It was a back-breaking task, gathering what little fuel you could find, often scavenging from the wreckage of your ship. Every scrap of wood, every oily rag became precious, and the effort was exhausting. The cold saps your strength, and the fuel is very limited, and then you wait, watching, hoping for a response. The problem is, it's quiet out there. The Arctic is vast. Visibility can be brutally limited by fog or snow, and even if someone does see your smoke, how far away are they? Do they have the means to reach you? Another method was flags, often fashioned from spare sails or pieces of brightly colored cloth, raising them on the highest point you can find, and hoping that the stark colors would be visible against the snow. But they're only useful if someone is actively looking. And again, distance is a killer. A tiny flag on the horizon is easily missed, especially if the weather isn't cooperating. Of course, explorers carried firearms, firing off rounds into the air. The sound of the shot carried further than a shout, a desperate attempt to pierce the Arctic silence. But ammunition was finite. Each shot was a gamble, a precious resource expended with no guarantee of return. And the constant use of gunpowder would also make you very aware of the rate you are losing it. Perhaps the most ingenious attempts involved mirrors, using polished metal to reflect sunlight, creating flashes that could be seen for miles. This required a steady hand, bright sunlight which was not always accessible, and a hefty dose of hope. The glint of sunlight on metal could be mistaken for anything: ice, water, or nothing at all. And then there's the psychological aspect. Every failed signal, every day that passes without a response, chips away at morale. The hope dwindles, despair creeps in. It's a constant battle to keep spirits up, but hope is what keeps you alive out there. Sometimes desperate messages were placed in sealed bottles and cast into the sea. These message drifts were a long shot, a plea in a bottle, hoping to be found and read by someone. The chances of a bottle surviving the ice, the currents, and eventually reaching civilization, they were slim. But it was something. It was a way of reaching out, of refusing to be forgotten. These messages were not just practical, they were a testament to the enduring human spirit. Even in the face of near certain death, there was a need to communicate, to leave a mark on the world. And some of these messages did end up reaching a destination. That small chance is enough. The Inuit peoples often helped explorers find rescue, if the explorers were fortunate enough to encounter them, of course. Indigenous knowledge of the land was invaluable. They knew the migration routes of animals, the location of shelters, and the safest paths across the ice. Building a relationship with the Inuit could mean the difference between survival and death. But language barriers, cultural differences, and a history of exploitation made these relationships complex and challenging to navigate. Not all interactions were friendly. Not all Inuit communities were willing or able to offer assistance. Some understandably saw the explorers as intruders, disrupting their way of life and depleting their resources. But even with all these efforts, the waiting is the hardest part. Days bleed into weeks. The cold gnaws at your bones. Hunger becomes a constant companion. The landscape remains stubbornly, mockingly silent. The mental toll is immense. Isolation breeds paranoia. Small disagreements escalate into bitter conflicts. The line between hope and delusion blurs. Some explorers succumbed to despair, losing the will to live, and simply wandering off into the ice, embracing death as a release. But others found strength they never knew they possessed. They clung to the belief that rescue was possible. They supported each other, sharing what little they had, offering words of encouragement. They focused on the small tasks, the daily routines that provided a sense of purpose and control. Gathering fuel, building shelters, tending to the sick and injured. And sometimes, against all odds, rescue arrived. A ship appearing on the horizon, a sled team emerging from the snow, a miraculous intervention that defied all expectations. It's important to remember that rescue wasn't always a happy ending. Many expeditions were lost entirely, swallowed by the Arctic without a trace, and even those who were rescued often suffered lasting physical and psychological scars. Frostbite, starvation, scurvy. These took a terrible toll, and the trauma of the experience haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. But it did happen. People did get saved. But there is one thing. Remember all the people who were not saved. The ones who succumbed to the cold and were never found. Honor them. All right, let's talk about the tough stuff. The kind of stuff that keeps you up at night, even when you're bone tired from hauling sledges across a frozen wasteland. We're talking about the ethical dilemmas that cropped up in the Arctic, those awful choices where there's no right answer, only shades of wrong. Imagine this, you're part of an expedition months into the journey. Food is dwindling. Scurvy is starting to set in. Hope is fading. You come across a small cache of supplies clearly left by another group. Do you take it? They might need it to survive, but if you don't, your own team could perish. What do? These weren't theoretical situations, folks. These were real-life scenarios faced by explorers, and the decisions they made, well, they weren't always pretty. One of the most agonizing ethical quandaries centered around food. Hunting was often the only way to survive, but it wasn't as simple as bagging a seal and calling it a day. Resources were scarce. Overhunting in one area could devastate the local wildlife population, impacting the Inuit communities who depended on those same animals for their livelihoods. Explorers often relied on the knowledge and assistance of the Inuit, learning their hunting techniques, building shelters, and navigating the ice. But this reliance also created a complex dynamic. How much could explorers take without depleting the resources vital to the Inuits' survival? Where did the line lie between necessary sustenance and exploitation? And what about when things got really desperate? There are whispers, hushed tones in the historical record about explorers resorting to cannibalism. It's a taboo subject, shrouded in shame and denial. But the evidence suggests it happened, at least in a few extreme cases. Think about the Donner Party, right? While not strictly Arctic explorers, their story illustrates the horrifying choices people face when starvation sets in. They were stranded in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and faced with starvation, they resorted to cannibalism. And of course, the Arctic explorers dealt with the same situations on occasion. Imagine the psychological toll. You're already battling the cold, the isolation, the constant threat of death. Now you're faced with the unthinkable, consuming the flesh of a fellow human being to survive. How do you live with that? How does that change you? The historical record isn't always clear on the specifics of these situations, and oftentimes we don't have any record to analyze. Diaries were lost, shame prevented open confessions, but the possibility of cannibalism casts a dark shadow over many Arctic expeditions, raising questions about the limits of human endurance and the price of survival. What would that look like? And even when cannibalism wasn't on the table, explorers faced other agonizing choices. Who gets the last rations? Who is too weak to continue and must be left behind? These decisions weighed heavily on the leaders of these expeditions, forcing them to play God in a situation where death seemed almost inevitable. There's the story of the Franklin expedition, a tragic example of how things can go horribly wrong. While the exact details remain shrouded in mystery, evidence suggests that the crew suffered from lead poisoning, scurvy, and starvation. Some researchers believe that desperation led to cannibalism. The whole expedition was an ethical tightrope that eventually snapped with devastating consequences. Beyond the immediate survival dilemmas, explorers also grappled with the ethical implications of their very presence in the Arctic. They were often driven by a thirst for fame, fortune, or scientific discovery, but their explorations disrupted the traditional way of life of the Inuit, introducing diseases, altering hunting patterns, and challenging their cultural beliefs. Was it right to impose their Western values and ambitions on a people who had thrived in the Arctic for centuries? Did the potential scientific gains justify the cultural disruption? These are questions that continue to resonate today as we grapple with the impact of globalization and the ethics of exploration in other remote regions. The Arctic explorers weren't saints. They were flawed human beings, operating in extreme circumstances, making difficult choices with limited information. Their actions often had unintended consequences, both positive and negative. But by examining their ethical dilemmas, by grappling with the complexities of their decisions, we can gain a deeper understanding of human nature and the challenges of navigating morally ambiguous situations. We can learn something about the limits of human endurance, the power of human connection, and the importance of considering the ethical implications of our actions, no matter how extreme the circumstances. And I think it's important to remember that the Arctic continues to present ethical challenges today. Climate change, resource extraction, and increasing tourism are all impacting the region and its inhabitants. The lessons learned from the early explorers can help us navigate these new challenges in a more responsible and ethical way. Documenting the experience. It's a concept that might seem almost quaint amidst the sheer brutality of Arctic exploration. I mean, you're battling frostbite, starvation, maybe even polar bears. Who has time to write in a diary? But keeping journals, logging observations, trying to make sense of the chaos, it was often a lifeline, a way to maintain sanity, to contribute something meaningful, even when survival felt like a distant dream. Think about it. These expeditions, they weren't just about planting flags and claiming territory. They were scientific endeavors, at least in part. Governments and wealthy patrons wanted to know what was there: the geography, the geology, the weather patterns, the animal life. All of it was valuable information. And who was going to collect it? The explorers themselves. Now you might imagine meticulously kept logs, filled with precise measurements and elegant prose, and sometimes that was the case. You had men like William Parry, a British naval officer known for his methodical approach. His journals are filled with detailed accounts of ice conditions, temperatures, and even the daily routines of his crew. He was a real stickler for detail, which is exactly the kind of dude you needed when navigating uncharted waters. But more often than not, documenting the experience was a messy, ad hoc affair. Imagine trying to write in a pitching ship, your fingers numb with cold, ink freezing in the pen, or huddled in a cramped, damp tent, battling the ever-present threat of scurvy, trying to recall the events of the day through a fog of exhaustion. Accuracy probably wasn't always the top priority. And yet, these journals, these scraps of paper filled with hurried notes and shaky handwriting, they're invaluable. They offer a glimpse into the reality of Arctic exploration that official reports often gloss over. You get a sense of the day-to-day struggles, the petty squabbles, the moments of camaraderie, the gnawing fear, the things that really made up the experience. Consider the diaries of the common sailors. These weren't trained scientists or seasoned explorers. They were just ordinary guys, often recruited from the streets of London or the fishing villages of Scotland, thrown into an environment that was completely alien to them. Their accounts are raw, unfiltered, and often surprisingly moving. They write about the relentless cold, the constant darkness, the longing for home, and of course the endless search for something, anything to eat. But it wasn't just personal accounts. Scientific observations were crucial. Explorers meticulously recorded weather patterns, tracked the movement of ice flows, and collected samples of plants and rocks. These weren't always easy tasks. Imagine trying to operate a sextant in a blizzard, or collecting geological specimens while fending off a hungry polar bear. It was hard work, and then there was the challenge of preserving these records. Paper and ink are surprisingly vulnerable in the Arctic environment. Dampness, mold, and those ever-present rodents could quickly destroy years of work. Explorers had to be resourceful, finding ways to protect their journals and specimens from the elements. Sometimes this meant wrapping them in waterproof cloth, or storing them in airtight containers. Other times, it just meant hoping for the best. But even when records did survive, there was no guarantee that they would be properly understood or appreciated back home. Many expeditions returned to face public indifference or even ridicule. Their discoveries were dismissed, their sacrifices forgotten, It wasn't always easy to convince people of the importance of exploring these remote, seemingly barren regions, and that's where the journals and scientific observations become so important. They're a testament to the dedication and resilience of these explorers. They show us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, they continue to document the world around them, to contribute to our understanding of this planet. They are an attempt at maintaining some sense of control in a place where nature does not care about your existence. They also serve as a warning, a reminder of the fragility of human life and the power of the natural world. The Arctic is a harsh and unforgiving environment. It demands respect, and the journals of these early explorers remind us of the price they paid for venturing into its icy embrace. So the next time you think about Arctic exploration, remember the journals. Remember the men and women who struggled to record their experiences, to leave behind a legacy of knowledge and understanding. Because in the end, that may be their most enduring contribution. The return journey. It's easy to imagine the triumphant explorer, flags waving, greeted as a hero upon their return. The reality, though, often a slow, agonizing crawl back from the brink. Exhaustion wasn't just a matter of being tired, it was a bone-deep weariness that settled into the very marrow. Imagine pushing your body to its absolute limit, day after day, for months on end with inadequate rest and recovery. Every step becomes a monumental effort. Muscles scream, joints ache, and the mind struggles to focus. It's like wading through treacle, each movement a victory against the crushing weight of fatigue. And then there's starvation. We talked about hunting, but securing consistent food was a constant battle. As supplies dwindled, the gnawing hunger becomes a relentless tormentor. It's not just an empty stomach, it's a pervasive weakness, a mental fog that obscures rational thought. The body begins to consume itself, stripping away fat reserves and then muscle tissue. The once robust explorer becomes gaunt, skeletal, their eyes sunken and haunted. Decisions become increasingly desperate, driven by the primal urge to find sustenance, any sustenance. Boots start to look like a snack. Remember scurvy. The effects are ramped up at this stage. Open sores fester, old wounds reopen, and the teeth, well you know. But more than that, the energy. Scurvy robs you of energy. Even if you could find food, you're too tired to hunt. A feedback loop of doom. The Arctic weather, well, it's relentless. The biting wind, the numbing cold, the driving snow, it never lets up. Imagine facing these conditions when you're already weakened, depleted, and struggling to stay alive. Frostbite becomes an ever-present threat, claiming fingers, toes, even noses. Hypothermia lurks in the shadows, ready to snatch away consciousness and then life itself. It's a battle against an implacable enemy, an environment that seems actively hostile to human existence. Every gust of wind feels like a personal assault, every snowflake a tiny dagger, and the psychological toll is immense. Hope, that fragile ember, flickers and threatens to extinguish. The vast, empty landscape mocks their efforts, a constant reminder of their isolation and vulnerability. The mind plays tricks, conjuring mirages, amplifying fears, and blurring the line between reality and delusion. The once unshakable conviction that drove them into the Arctic wilderness now wavers, replaced by doubt and despair. Arguments flare up. Petty squabbles become major conflicts. The bonds of camaraderie that once held the group together fray and threaten to snap. The desperation for survival overrides all else, turning companions into competitors. The weight of responsibility for the lives of others becomes unbearable, the fear of failure a constant companion. The decision to turn back, if it hasn't been made already, weighs heavily. It's an admission of defeat, a shattering of dreams, but it's also a recognition of reality, a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. And even turning back offers no guarantee of survival. The journey back is just as perilous, just as demanding, and perhaps even more so because now they're facing it with depleted resources and shattered morale. Navigation becomes even more critical. Mistakes can be fatal. The ice shifts, the weather changes, and landmarks become obscured. Getting lost means certain death. The journals of these expeditions are filled with accounts of desperate attempts to find their way, using rudimentary instruments, relying on fading memories, and trusting in a little bit of luck. And through it all, there's the silence. The Arctic silence, broken only by the wind and the creaking of the ice. It's a silence that can be both comforting and terrifying. A silence that amplifies the inner turmoil, the doubts, the fears. A silence that can drive a person to the edge of madness. It's a slow, agonizing process of attrition, a gradual whittling away of life itself. Some succumb to the elements, their bodies claimed by the ice and snow. Others simply give up, succumbing to despair. But some, driven by an indomitable will to survive, push on, one step at a time, battling exhaustion, starvation, and the relentless Arctic weather. They are the ones who, against all odds, make it back, forever changed by their experience, carrying the scars of the Arctic wilderness, both physical and psychological. They were not quite the same after that. The romanticized image of the rugged explorer returning home to fanfare and celebration often obscures a far more somber reality. The Arctic leaves its mark, etching itself onto the mind and body in ways that linger long after the ice fades from view. We're not just talking about frostbite scars or the lingering aches of old injuries. We're talking about a deep, pervasive trauma. Imagine enduring months, even years, in an environment designed to break you. The crushing isolation, the constant threat of death, the gnawing hunger, the unrelenting cold, it all takes a toll. These weren't weekend camping trips. These were struggles for survival where the slightest mistake could be fatal. One of the most insidious wounds the Arctic inflicts is psychological. Think about the mental fortitude required to face perpetual darkness, knowing the sun won't grace the horizon for months. The human brain isn't wired for that. It craves light, connection, stimulation. Deprived of these, explorers often succumbed to what was then called Arctic hysteria, a constellation of symptoms including depression, irritability, paranoia, and even hallucinations. We now understand this as a form of seasonal affective disorder, exacerbated by extreme isolation and stress. But back then, it was a terrifying mystery, a sign of weakening resolve, often met with scorn rather than understanding. Imagine the shame and fear of feeling your mind unravel, knowing your companions might see you as a liability, a threat to their survival. And then there's the survivor's guilt. Many expeditions resulted in loss. Men were claimed by the ice, succumbing to scurvy, frostbite, or simply bad luck. The survivors carried the weight of those deaths, questioning their decisions, wondering if they could have done more. The Arctic doesn't offer easy answers. It forces you to confront your limitations, your mortality, and the arbitrary nature of survival. Consider the physical toll too. Scurvy, a constant threat, wasn't just a matter of bleeding gums and loose teeth. It caused excruciating pain, debilitating weakness, and ultimately, death. The desperation to find a cure, any cure, led explorers to try anything, from ineffective herbal remedies to consuming raw meat in hopes of gleaning some elusive vitamin C. Even those who avoided scurvy often suffered permanent physical damage. Frostbite could leave them with amputated fingers or toes, making everyday tasks a constant challenge. The extreme cold could trigger chronic conditions like arthritis and rheumatism, turning every winter into a painful reminder of their time in the Arctic. The expeditions themselves were often marked by accidents, falls on the ice, injuries from hunting, mishaps with equipment. Without proper medical care, these injuries could fester, leading to chronic pain and disability. Explorers returned home with bodies broken and scarred, carrying a legacy of physical suffering that would last a lifetime. Beyond the individual trauma, these experiences could fracture relationships. The intense pressure of survival could breed conflict and resentment. Men who had once been comrades could become bitter enemies, haunted by shared experiences they couldn't reconcile. The return home didn't always bring healing. Sometimes it just amplified the divisions, leaving families and communities torn apart by the Arctic's legacy. Many explorers struggled to reintegrate into society. They had witnessed things that others couldn't comprehend, endured hardships that seemed almost impossible. They felt alienated, disconnected from the normalcy of everyday life. Some turned to alcohol to numb the pain, while others withdrew into themselves, unable to share their experiences. The heroic narratives often gloss over this difficult reality. We celebrate the achievements, the discoveries, the triumphs over adversity. But we rarely acknowledge the lasting scars, the hidden wounds that lingered long after the flags were planted and the maps were drawn. It's important to remember that these explorers were human beings, not superheroes. They were driven by ambition, curiosity, and a desire to make their mark on the world. But they were also vulnerable to the psychological and physical traumas of the Arctic. Understanding this reality allows us to appreciate their achievements even more, recognizing the immense cost of their exploration. It forces us to consider the ethical implications of pushing the boundaries of human endurance and the responsibility we have to care for those who bear the scars of exploration. The Arctic, in its stark beauty and unforgiving nature, demands a reckoning, and that reckoning must include an honest assessment of the trauma it inflicts. Okay, so imagine you've just spent what feels like a lifetime battling the Arctic. You're finally back, shivering less now, maybe even with a little bit of a tan, but definitely changed. You step off the ship or out of the train, expecting cheers, maybe a parade. What you often got, though, was complicated. Think about it from their perspective. People back home were reading sensationalized newspaper articles, maybe even believing some of the wilder claims about the North. They had this image of brave heroes conquering a frozen wasteland, but the reality was often messy, brutal, and frankly, a bit embarrassing. One of the first things explorers faced was public scrutiny. Were they really the first to reach the North Pole? Had they exaggerated their findings? Did they actually discover anything of value, or just waste a lot of time and money? The press, hungry for a story, would dissect every detail, often twisting things to fit a narrative. And then there was the skepticism. Scientists back home, who hadn't risked their lives in the Arctic, would pick apart your data, question your methods, and sometimes even accuse you of fraud. Imagine coming back after years of hardship, only to be told that your observations were inaccurate, your conclusions were flawed, and your entire expedition was a waste. It was a real kick in the teeth. Part of this skepticism stemmed from a genuine lack of understanding. People just couldn't fathom the conditions, the challenges, the sheer scale of the Arctic. They couldn't grasp the psychological toll of isolation, the constant threat of starvation, the mind-numbing monotony of endless ice. It was like trying to explain a dream to someone who wasn't there. But there was also a darker side to the skepticism, a kind of resentment. Some people saw Arctic explorers as glory-seeking adventurers, wasting valuable resources on pointless endeavors. They questioned the motives, the ethics, and the ultimate value of these expeditions. Why risk so many lives for what? A flag on a frozen rock? The burden of proof was always on the explorers. They had to defend their actions, justify their expenses, and convince the public that their efforts were worthwhile. This often meant giving lectures, writing books, and engaging in endless rounds of interviews, all while trying to process the trauma of their experiences. It was exhausting. Beyond the public scrutiny and skepticism, there was the immense challenge of reintegration. Imagine spending years in a world of ice and snow, where survival was the only goal. Then, suddenly, you're back in civilization, surrounded by noise, crowds, and a bewildering array of choices. It was a shock to the system. Simple things became overwhelming. The abundance of food, the comfort of a warm bed, the constant chatter of people. It could all be incredibly disorienting. Some explorers found it difficult to adjust to the pace of life, the social expectations, the sheer normality of it all. And then there was the disconnect with loved ones. Years away could change people. Relationships strained, families shifted, and returning explorers often found themselves feeling like strangers in their own homes. It was a painful realization that life had gone on without them, and that they had missed out on so much. The psychological scars of the Arctic also made reintegration difficult. Many explorers suffered from what we might now call PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, and depression. The trauma of near-death experiences, the constant stress of survival, and the psychological toll of isolation left deep wounds that were difficult to heal. Some explorers turned to alcohol or other forms of self-medication to cope with their demons. Others withdrew from society, unable to face the reminders of their past. The Arctic had changed them in ways that were impossible to undo, leaving them forever haunted by their experiences. Even those who appeared to adjust successfully often struggled in silence. They might have achieved fame and recognition, but they carried the weight of their experiences with them, forever marked by the Arctic. It was a heavy burden to bear. The reception back home, then, was rarely the triumphant homecoming that explorers might have dreamed of. It was a complex, often painful process, filled with scrutiny, skepticism, and the immense challenge of reintegration. It was a stark reminder that the true cost of Arctic exploration extended far beyond the physical hardships endured in the frozen north. It was a cost that many explorers paid for the rest of their lives. And it begs the question, was the fame, the supposed glory, really worth all that sacrifice? It's a question they likely pondered many times over, staring out at a world that just couldn't quite understand, a world that wasn't there. Okay, so, as we wrap up our little journey through the realities of Arctic exploration, let's gently drift into a discussion of its lasting impact. It's easy to get caught up in the tales of heroism and survival, but what did all that suffering actually achieve? What tangible benefits did these often ill-fated expeditions bring back to the world? And just as importantly, where did they go wrong? Because sometimes learning what not to do is just as valuable. Firstly, let's talk science. These early explorers, despite facing unimaginable hardships, were often meticulous observers. They weren't just stumbling around in the snow, they were collecting data, mapping coastlines, and documenting the flora and fauna of a region previously unknown to the Western world. Think about it, they were essentially pioneering entire fields of study. Meteorology, for example, benefited immensely from the consistent weather observations recorded during Arctic voyages. Understanding atmospheric patterns in the Arctic helped scientists develop a more comprehensive picture of global climate systems. Then there's geography. Before these expeditions, maps of the Arctic were, well, let's just say they were largely guesswork. Explorers like Parry, Ross, and Franklin dedicated years to painstakingly charting coastlines, identifying islands, and mapping waterways. Their work laid the foundation for future exploration and navigation, providing a framework for understanding the Arctic's complex geography. Even when expeditions ended in disaster, like Franklin's, the subsequent search efforts contributed significantly to mapping vast stretches of the Canadian Arctic. They literally filled in the blank spaces on the map, And it wasn't just about maps and weather. Natural history also flourished. Explorers brought back specimens of plants, animals, and geological samples, allowing scientists back home to study the unique biodiversity of the Arctic. These findings contributed to a better understanding of evolution, adaptation, and the interconnectedness of life on Earth. They documented things like the migration patterns of birds, the feeding habits of whales, and the unique adaptations of Arctic foxes to survive in extreme cold. It's pretty impressive when you think about it. Of course, we can't talk about the scientific impact without acknowledging the contributions of the Inuit and other indigenous peoples. For centuries, they had accumulated a wealth of knowledge about the Arctic environment, knowledge that was often dismissed or ignored by European explorers. However, when explorers actually listened and learned from the Inuit, learning their survival techniques, their knowledge of animal behavior, and their understanding of ice conditions, their chances of success dramatically increased. Recognizing the value of indigenous knowledge is, in itself, a significant lesson learned from Arctic exploration. But it wasn't all sunshine and scientific breakthroughs. The history of Arctic exploration is also littered with errors and misjudgments. Some of these were simply due to a lack of technology or understanding, but others were the result of arrogance, cultural insensitivity, and a refusal to learn from those who already knew the land. Scurvy, for instance, was a recurring scourge, despite the fact that the cure, vitamin C, was readily available in the form of citrus fruits and certain plants. The failure to understand and address this simple dietary deficiency led to countless deaths and untold suffering. It's kind of hard to believe, right? Another significant error was the reliance on outdated navigational techniques and flawed assumptions about the Arctic environment. Many expeditions were hampered by inaccurate charts, unreliable compasses, and a poor understanding of ice dynamics. The Northwest Passage in particular proved to be a frustrating and deadly lure, with explorers repeatedly underestimating the challenges of navigating its icy waters. And then there's the ethical dimension. The pursuit of fame and fortune often overshadowed the well-being of the explorers themselves and the indigenous populations they encountered. Explorers sometimes exploited and mistreated their crews, pushing them to the brink of exhaustion and even death in the pursuit of their goals. They also engaged in questionable trading practices with the Inuit, disrupting traditional economies and introducing diseases that decimated local populations. The desire to discover and claim territory often blinded them to the fact that the Arctic was already inhabited and had been for thousands of years. Looking back, it's clear that the legacy of Arctic exploration is a complex and multifaceted one. It's a story of scientific discovery, geographical mapping, and human endurance, but it's also a story of errors, misjudgments, and ethical failures. By understanding both the contributions and the mistakes of these early explorers, we can gain valuable insights into the challenges and responsibilities of exploration in any environment, whether it's the Arctic, outer space, or the depths of the ocean. It's about learning from the past so we don't repeat the same mistakes in the future. And that's a pretty important lesson for all of us. Okay, so we've explored the trials, the tribulations, the sheer unrelenting hardship that defined Arctic exploration. We've seen the ambition, the bravery, and the terrible cost. Now, let's take a moment, just a moment, to remember those who didn't make it back. It's important, I think, to acknowledge the weight of their absence. The Arctic, you see, doesn't give up its secrets easily. It demands a price sometimes paid in lives. These weren't just names on a ship's manifest, or entries in a captain's log. They were fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, men with hopes, dreams and families waiting for them back home. Imagine the agonizing wait, the slow fade of hope as the years drifted by with no word. The unanswered questions, the what-ifs that must have haunted those families forever. Think of Franklin's lost expedition. All 129 men vanished into the icy wastes. For years their fate remained a complete mystery. Decades passed before the truth began to emerge. Starvation, scurvy, lead poisoning, a horrific descent into unimaginable suffering. And then there are others, less famous but no less deserving of our remembrance. Sailors swept overboard in raging storms, hunters lost on the ice, never to be seen again. Scientists who succumbed to disease, far from medical help. Each one a life extinguished too soon, swallowed by the unforgiving Arctic landscape. But it's not just about remembering the names. It's about grappling with the ethical complexities, the moral price of exploration itself. Was the pursuit of geographical knowledge, of scientific advancement, really worth the sacrifice of so many lives? It's a question that lingers, I think, especially when you consider the motives driving these expeditions. Yes, there was the thirst for knowledge, the genuine desire to push the boundaries of human understanding. But let's be honest, there was also the lure of fame, the ambition for personal glory, the nationalistic competition to plant a flag on uncharted territory. How much of that ambition was truly noble, and how much was driven by ego, by the desire for power and recognition? And what about the impact on the indigenous populations, the Inuit, the Sami, the other Arctic peoples who had called these lands home for centuries? Their lives were irrevocably changed by the arrival of European explorers. Sometimes there were mutually beneficial exchanges, knowledge shared, skills learned, but often there was exploitation, disease, and the disruption of traditional ways of life. Exploration, you see, isn't always a story of pure heroism and triumph. It's often a story of unintended consequences, of ethical compromises, and of a complicated legacy that we're still grappling with today. We can admire the courage and resilience of these early explorers, but we must also acknowledge the cost of their endeavors, the human cost, the environmental cost, and the cultural cost. And in remembering the lost, we also need to confront the darker aspects of these expeditions. The stories of cannibalism, of desperation that led men to do unspeakable things. These aren't comfortable truths, but they are part of the story. They remind us that even in the face of extreme hardship, there are lines that should not be crossed, that even survival has its moral boundaries. The Arctic is a powerful reminder of our own limitations, of the fragility of human life. In the face of nature's raw power, it tests us, pushes us to our breaking point. And in that crucible, we see both the best and the worst of humanity. So, let us remember those who were lost, not just as names etched on monuments, but as individuals who faced the ultimate test and whose sacrifices shaped our understanding of this extraordinary and unforgiving place. Let their memories serve as a reminder of the price of exploration and of our responsibility to learn from the past, to explore with humility, with respect, and with a deep awareness of the consequences of our actions. It's the least we can do. All right, let's drift into some of the deeper currents, shall we? After all that hardship, all that struggle, what did the Arctic teach us? It wasn't just about maps and measurements, it was about us. First and foremost, the Arctic expeditions are a stark monument to human resilience. When you're facing constant gnawing cold, starvation staring you in the face, and the crushing isolation, well, it's easy to just give up. Curl up, let the ice claim you. But these explorers, they kept going. They rigged up makeshift sails with whatever scraps they could find. They hunted seals with tools they forged themselves. They shared the meager rations. Even when their bellies screamed, they found ways to fight back against oblivion. It's a quiet kind of heroism, isn't it? Not the flashy kind you see in movies, but the deep, unwavering kind that comes from knowing you're all that stands between yourself, your companions, and a frozen grave. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What's your breaking point? What reserves of strength are lying dormant inside you, waiting for the moment you need them most? The Arctic reminds us that we're capable of far more than we often believe. And then there's the power of nature. We talk about conquering the Arctic, but that's just ego talking. The Arctic doesn't care about our flags, our ambitions, our scientific instruments. It's indifferent. It's a force of nature so vast and unforgiving that it can swallow entire ships, entire expeditions, without even noticing. And these explorers, they learned that. They learned to respect the ice, to read the weather, to understand the movements of the animals they depended on for survival. They became students of the Arctic, not masters of it. It's a humbling lesson, isn't it? We live in a world where we're surrounded by technology, by climate control, by comforts that shield us from the raw power of nature. But the Arctic whispers a different story. It reminds us that we are still, at our core, creatures of this planet, subject to its whims, dependent on its resources. We can't control nature. Not really. We can only adapt, respect, and try to understand. There is a profound beauty in this power. A reminder of how small we are on a cosmic scale. But I think the biggest lesson, the one that truly resonates, is the enduring allure of the unknown. Why did these explorers risk everything to venture into the Arctic? Fame, fortune, maybe for some, but I think it was something deeper than that. It was a yearning, a curiosity, a need to push the boundaries of what's known, to see what's over the horizon, to chart the uncharted. It's the same impulse that drives us to explore space, to delve into the mysteries of the universe. It's a fundamental part of what makes us human. We are explorers by nature, and the Arctic, in its vast, desolate mystery, offers the ultimate challenge to that spirit. Think about it. In a world that feels increasingly mapped, increasingly documented, increasingly predictable, the Arctic remains a frontier, a place where the unexpected can happen at any moment, where the rules are different, where the possibilities, both terrifying and exhilarating, are endless. And that allure, it persists. Even now, with satellites mapping every inch of the Arctic, with climate change transforming its landscape, the spirit of exploration still burns bright. Scientists are studying the melting ice, searching for clues to our planet's future. Indigenous communities are sharing their ancient knowledge, helping us understand the delicate balance of this fragile ecosystem. And yes, there are still adventurers drawn to the Arctic by that same yearning, that same curiosity, that same need to push the boundaries. The Arctic expeditions weren't just about finding new lands or claiming new territories. They were about testing the limits of human endurance, about learning to respect the power of nature, and about embracing the allure of the unknown. And those lessons, they're timeless. They're relevant to all of us, no matter where we live, no matter what we do, because at the end of the day, we're all explorers, charting our own course through the uncharted waters of life. And the Arctic, in its stark, unforgiving beauty, reminds us that the journey is what truly matters. And to take care out there on your own adventures. Sleep well,